My name is Bruce Gunther. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Portland Art Museum, and I'd like to welcome you this evening for a lecture in conjunction with our Masterworks Portland exhibition, Francis Bacon. It is my pleasure to introduce Patricia Failing, whom I sort of figured out that I've known for 30 plus years recently. She is much younger. But she is also a Professor Emerita from the University of Washington Division of Art History. She received her MA from the University of California in Berkeley in the 70s. She has taught with distinction contemporary art and criticism at the University of Washington into the present. I met her first because she was an editor at Art News magazine. And of course, being a curator, always on the make, you wanted to know the writers who were writing smartly about your field. And she has served all of us well by writing not only about critical issues, legal issues, and artist practice internationally, but also has represented and advocated the artists of our region in the national press through her thoughtful essays on various artists, and 2 books on artists who are associated with our region, Howard Kotler, and a colleague of hers at the University of Washington, and Doris Chase. She taught for a period of time also at Reed College and Lewis and Clark College. She has authored innumerable articles which have made her the go-to person for issues of Degas sculptures and bronzes of various generations. She has spent time and energy trying to sort out what has become an amazing conundrum of authorship and legal rights connected with this great artist of the 19th century. But she has also investigated and taught Futurism, Dada, and Surrealism. And it is in that sense, for me, the reason that we are gathered here tonight, because Francis Bacon, who begins inside a surrealist dream and finds a vocabulary of the body, of identity and sexuality, as well as representation, that Patricia Failing will explore, debunk, and illuminate. Join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Patricia Failing. Thank you.
First of all, thanks to Bruce for inviting me here this evening, and thank you all for coming. This evening we'll review a range of Francis Bacon's figure paintings that were created over several decades, including the Lucien Freud triptych, now on view in the museum. The title of the lecture comes from Bacon's own description of his creative process. Bacon said that he wanted to trap an image on canvas, much the way images are trapped by the camera. But more specifically, he wanted to trap certain facts about human existence, the sweat and the smell of human flesh, as well as bodies convulsed and deformed by invisible forces. For the viewer, the facts that Bacon foregrounds in his paintings can sometimes be disquieting or even horrific. So tonight we'll consider the work of several writers who have tried to account for the experiences that many viewers have when they confront Bacon's images. And then you can decide whether any of these interpretations line up with your own impressions. So we'll begin with a little biographical interlude, even though our focus this evening will be on the experience of viewers on reception. This is a photograph of Francis Bacon taken in 1952. Francis Bacon was born in Dublin to a middle-class English family, and he grew up in an environment of violence between English and Irish partisans. His father was a retired army officer who was not at all pleased when he learned that his teenage son was gay. He eventually sent his son to Berlin with a chaperone to get straightened out. Now, We might say, what was this man thinking? He sent his son to Berlin in 1927, to Kurt Weill's Berlin, to Threepenny Opera Berlin, where the young man easily found opportunities for masochistic sexual experiences. From Berlin, Bacon found his way to Paris, where he began designing rugs and furniture that were shameless rip-offs of Le Corbusier, by his own admission, and perhaps not surprisingly, he was quite successful. Another photo from the same series, in 1952, the photographer is Henri Cartier-Bresson. Bacon was very severely affected by asthma all his life, and he missed out on a great deal of formal education in his youth, but he became a very successful autodidact and eventually became very well-read and knowledgeable about Western literature and philosophy. He also taught himself how to paint, and he began showing and selling some of his work in the early and mid-1930s. He painted very little after 1936, and he destroyed much of his early production. He returned to painting again during World War II, often appropriating images from photographs and fragments of photographs that he clipped from magazines and newspapers. And he continued this practice throughout his career. Bacon had not exhibited his work in public for several years when this 1944 triptych entitled "Three Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion" appeared in a London gallery in 1945. Not a surprise, the paintings caused quite a sensation. The British critic and art historian John Russell, who later became chief art critic at the New York Times, described his reaction to these half-human, half-animal creatures. Their anatomy, he said, was human and animal, and they were confined to a low-ceiling, windowless, and oddly proportioned space. They could bite and probe and suck, and they had very long, eel-like necks. But their functioning in other respects was mysterious. We had no name for them, and no name for what we felt about them. The images were so unrelievably awful that the mind just snaps shut. They were regarded as freaks, as monsters, irrelevant to the concerns of the day, and the product of an imagination so eccentric as to not count in any permanent way. Most people just hoped they would quietly be put aside. Now, John Russell later became a convert to Bacon's work and wrote what came to be regarded as the standard text on Bacon's art. The middle figure in the triptych here. Bacon referred to these three figures as the Humanities, the name that was preferred by the writer T.S. Eliot for the mythical female Furies who pursue Orestes after he killed his mother in the ancient Greek story. The bloodthirsty Furies swoop and moan and chant, "Get him, get him, get him, get him, make sure." Bacon was a fan of Eliot's dramas, particularly Sweeney Agonistes, based on the story of Orestes, and Eliot later became a collector of Bacon's work. Bacon was not only drawn to the Furies as characters, in this case, a Fury blinded by rage, he was also drawn to the words spoken by the leader of the Furies. "The reek of human blood smiles out at me." Now, in this metaphor, the reek of human blood smiles out at me, a bloody wound gapes open like a smile, and blood is present not just visually, but also in the sense of smell. And as we'll see, it's this kind of complex and violent sensory experience that Bacon attempts to trap in his representations of bodies. The title of the triptych is important. The title is Three Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion, not the Crucifixion. Bacon was an unswerving atheist, an admirer of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Bacon took it for granted that we live in a world in which there is no God to uphold moral absolutes. For Bacon, the meaning of a crucifixion is to exemplify human behavior. It's an illustration of the way that people behave toward one another. When the paintings were first shown in April 1945, they may have seemed irrelevant to the concerns of the day, as Russell believed, but they found a compelling context between April and June of 1945, when British newspapers published the first sensational photographs of Benito Mussolini's corpse hung upside down in a public square, and the burned-out bunker where Hitler committed suicide. Most horrific of all were the photographs of Jewish survivors liberated in June from Hitler's concentration camps. Bacon's furies were obviously no match for the grotesque behavior of thousands of human beings. It's not surprising, therefore, to find that Bacon's work first began to resonate for viewers in a post-war climate of pessimism, despair, and disillusionment. Bacon's monsters are still seen as the products of an eccentric imagination, working at a time when, as one historian put it, despair was in fashion. But their art historical context is relevant as well. Bacon was quite familiar with Picasso's figures from the late 1920s and early 30s, when Picasso was flirting with Surrealism. Bacon admired Picasso, he said, for demonstrating that, quote, realism can draw from the unconscious. And this is Picasso's painting called Woman by the Sea from 1929. The far right-hand part of the triptych here. But Bacon remodeled Picasso's distorted figures and faces into a more savage repertoire of extremes. His goal, he said, was to unlock the valves of feeling and therefore return the onlooker to life more violently. Now, we don't typically associate renderings of the crucifixion with mid-century modernist painting, but the crucifixion scenes were a major preoccupation of perhaps Great Britain's most renowned modernist painter in the 40s and the 50s, Graham Sutherland. And this is a crucifixion scene by Graham Sutherland from 1946. Sutherland was a devout Catholic, inspired by the kind of Christian pantheism that infuses the poetry of William Wordsworth and the paintings of Samuel Palmer. Sutherland's neo-romantic nature poetry inspired this 1945 painting from his so-called Thorn period, when Sutherland utilized the natural form of a thorn and thorn trees as a visual motif for representing Christ's suffering on the cross. Graham Sutherland and Bacon became friends in the 1930s, and later Sutherland actively promoted Bacon's work. Sutherland painted the crucifixion, which obviously had a very different meaning for him than the subject did for Bacon, the non-believer. Nevertheless, Sutherland did call Bacon's attention to this kind of subject matter. In retrospect, we can see that this 1944 triptych prefigures a constitutional format that Bacon relied upon throughout his career. Single figures centered on a relatively unarticulated color field, bodies supported or framed by some sort of geometric scaffold or cage, a focus on mouth and teeth, and the triptych format, which Bacon related to a filmmaking device of using 3 different cameras to shoot the same scene from 3 different angles. This is an untitled Francis Bacon painting from 1946. There's a complex debate among Bacon experts about the artist's relationship to another art historical context, which Bruce Gunther mentioned, Surrealism. With the support of critics such as Herbert Reed, and Roland Penrose, Surrealism remained a cornerstone of British modernism in the aftermath of World War II. This Bacon composition from 1946 shares with classic French Surrealism the strategy of incongruous juxtapositions. Here we have meat together with an umbrella, and display of a figure in a hallucinatory space that seems to have its origin in a nightmare, where the face is reduced to a gaping mouth. Also, like the French Surrealist, Bacon worked spontaneously and developed his imagery in the act of painting, although he sometimes did make preliminary drawings despite his claims to the contrary. But Bacon's objectives were quite different from those of the Surrealists, who created unpremeditated images in order to mine them for clues of the character of unconscious life. For the most part, Bacon disavowed psychoanalytic readings of his work. Instead, he used spontaneous marks and chance configurations of paint to primarily to work against himself, to break up his own compositional cliches or disrupt the orderly progress of painting. In this painting, the pigment is quite visceral. It's clotted and smeared and applied with rags and fingers or straight from the tube. Bacon experts do see an important relationship between Bacon's work and the writings of dissident surrealist Georges Bataille. Bataille was the leader of a surrealist faction that broke away from the group's leadership in the late 1920s and published its own influential journal in Paris called Documents. Among his other preoccupations, Bataille was fascinated by a range of human experience we literally share with other animals: psychic experiences like involuntary fright, and anatomical experiences like physical decay, experiences that illustrate a zone of non-discrimination between humans and other animals. In the journal Documents, Bataille published a notorious series of photographs of slaughterhouses, the abattoir, businesses that we keep behind closed doors, according to Bataille, because most people are unable to tolerate their own ugliness, unable to tolerate the reality of their own being as meat. And this is one of the photographs from the series in Documents. They're by Eli Lothar, and this photograph shows animal hoofs lined up outside the of one of the slaughterhouses. Francis Bacon owned copies of Documents, and he studied the pictures of the slaughterhouses. "I've always been moved by pictures about slaughterhouses and meat," he said, "and to me, they belong to very much to the whole thing of the crucifixion." It's a photograph of Francis Bacon. Bacon was mesmerized by real slabs of meat in butcher shops, and like Bataille, he rejected the hypocrisy of averting one's eye from the slaughterhouse. Bacon observed that when you go into a butcher's shop, you see how beautiful meat can be, and then you should think of the whole horror of life, one thing living off another. Another historical aside, in 1948, 2 years after this painting was created, Bacon's friend Graham Sutherland convinced Alfred Barr to acquire this painting for the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it became the first of Bacon's paintings to enter a collection of a U.S. museum. As for Bacon, with his earnings from the sale, he moved to Monte Carlo to gamble for 2 years. And he remained quite cynical and a pessimist, but he characterized his psychic state as exhilarated despair. In addition to butcher shops, Bacon was also especially fascinated by the physicality of visual surfaces in paintings by Rembrandt and Velazquez, although he knew the work of these artists primarily through reproductions. Bacon was so attached to reproductions of this 17th century Velazquez painting of Pope Innocent X that he reportedly decided not to see the actual painting when he had the opportunity. "I've always had a crush on this painting," he said. Pope Innocent X, as some of you might recall, was the notorious pope who presided over the church during the Spanish Inquisition. In the early and mid-1950s, Bacon painted a series of studies, which are now quite frequently reproduced, based on Velázquez's portrait of Innocent X. These images have been aptly described as showing the Pope in full shriek, as if the tall, gilded throne had become a switched-on electric chair. And this is one of his series of paintings based on Velázquez's work from 1953. The Pope paintings became the most successful paintings of Bacon's early career, although the artist had reservations about the outcome. I think if I'd thought more about what causes someone to scream, I would have made the scream I tried to paint more successful, he said. In fact, these paintings were too abstract. Now, you may by now have noticed that Bacon has a preoccupation with the mouth. And perhaps in this case, the painting became too abstract because Bacon's models for the screaming figures were indexical images instead of real people. To be more literal, Bacon worked primarily from films or photographs as models for the scream. Over the years, Bacon kept copies of this film still from Sergei Eisenstein's 1925 film, Battleship Potemkin. The character in the still is the nanny who, after being shot in the eye by the Cossacks, screams as she watches the baby and the baby carriage she had been holding plunge down a long set of stone stairs where the baby is also shot. George Bataille also reproduced photographs of screaming mouths in documents, along with his commentary that, quote, "On great occasions, human life is concentrated bestially in the mouth. Atrocious suffering makes the mouth the organ of tearing cries." It's easy to observe on this subject that the stricken individual, in stretching out his neck, frantically lifts up his head so that the mouth comes to be placed, so far as possible, as the extension of the spinal cord, that is to say, the position it normally occupies in the animal constitution. Bacon's mother moved to South Africa after his father died, and Bacon visited her there in the early 1950s. He became fascinated with animals in wildlife refuges and painted this image of a screaming chimpanzee in 1953. It's an obvious counterpart to the screaming Humanities and screaming popes, illustrating a certain instinctive physical convulsion shared by animal and human bodies. Beginning also in the 50s, Bacon's work often references homoeroticism in general and his own current lover in particular. There are two portrait faces here, Bacon and his first real love, Peter Lacy, a former Royal Air Force pilot whom Bacon met when he, Bacon, was 43 years old. The figures in this 1953 composition, which is titled Two Figures, were modeled on photographs again, in this case, images of men wrestling from Edward Muybridge's late 19th century studies of figures in motion. This series shows you the relevant photographs related to the painting. Bacon frequently modeled the action of his figures on Muybridge's photographs, in this case, to illustrate a literal conflation of physical violence and sexual desire. About his relationship with Lacey, Bacon said, "Being in love in an extreme way, being totally obsessed with someone, is like having a dreadful disease. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy." Bacon scholars have struggled to explain how violence is conceived in Bacon's paintings. He doesn't literally illustrate violence or use violent methods of applying paint. What he seems to achieve, they think, is a kind of remaking of the reality, of the violence of reality in paint. This painting is not just about human figures, it's also about violent forces driving human bodies, sweating, ejaculating, crying out, moved by the deepest instinctual drives, somewhere, again, in that indeterminate zone between the human and the beast. In Bacon's very cynical worldview, what counts as optimism are the involuntary responses of the nervous system. The fact that even if you're beaten to the ground and unconscious, your muscles will still twitch. There's still a kind of vital energy in your body that resists or persists even when you can't use your will to move or move voluntarily. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze comments on this involuntary vitality in his book, inspired by Bacon's paintings, called The Logic of Sensation. Deleuze writes that Bacon's primary subject is what he calls the body without organs, the body that lies beneath the surface, the body insofar as it is deformed or convulsed by a plurality of invisible forces, the need to vomit or defecate or copulate, for example. The concept of a body without organs involves an imaginary remapping of the biological body as a space permeated by unstable flows in all directions, moving at various speeds, ranging from the slow pace of biological growth to the urgent force of a scream. Now, obviously, this is not an easy picture to contemplate, not just because the bodies seem to be convulsed by powerful, involuntary forces, but because Bacon has positioned his audience as witnesses to a sadistic and forbidden sexual act. Sodomy was against the law in Britain until 1967. Here, Bacon pushes the pleasure of looking quite literally into the realm of voyeurism. It's still a pleasure for many, but a guilty pleasure for others. And this painting is somewhat unusual for Bacon in that it contains two figures in the same frame, and this conjunction raises questions for the viewer about possible relationships between the figures. The composition invites us to imagine a story, a narrative that would explain why these two beings came to be where they are. Yet Bacon was deeply hostile to narrative in paintings. For him, the narrative is equivalent to blinding. Narrative is the natural enemy of vision, diverting viewer attention from what there is to see. Narrative is also boring because it shuts out the direct actualization of the painting as a perceptual experience. So Bacon ultimately decided that he would, quote, usually just use one figure so the story wouldn't talk louder than the paint, end of quote. Now, this painting, incidentally, for many years, was owned by Lucien Freud. This is a composition called Study for a Human Body from 1974. So, leaping forward a couple of decades, we find Bacon reiterating the same basic iconography and compositional strategy. Here, instead of a bed, we have a long green geometric plane and a single figure positioned in a very ambiguous space. The form of the body is distorted, but it still convincingly suggests a physically powerful male. As Deleuze points out, at first glance, what you see is a figure isolated on a field of color. But when you look again, you begin to notice complexity. The green field of color also curls around and over the figure, if you look at the lower left of the plane, for example. And at the same time, the figure seems to strain forward into the green plane with a kind of muscular athleticism. But the beginning and the end of this body are not spelled out for us, and the right arm appears to be wounded and bleeding for reasons that are not explained. The work of George Bataille has again been cited to articulate some of the effects of these kinds of images. And this is George Bataille in Paris, outside a slaughterhouse, looking at what you might find from a slaughterhouse. Bataille, as you recall, was critical of what he regarded as bourgeois denial of the body as meat, the hypocritical denial of the base repulsive materiality of the body that bleeds and decays and putrefies, denial of the body as material that degrades and disintegrates. And this denial is part of a larger aversion to formlessness, according to Bataille. The task of conventional knowledge, he wrote, is to make sure everything has its proper form, to make sure every concept has defined boundaries and limits. The dirty little secret our knowledge systems try to pave over, he says, is the fact that our concepts and experiences continually exceed their limits and refuse to stay bounded. Meanings are constantly being shifted by dynamic relationships that concepts and images develop with one another. Our concepts and experiences are constantly decaying around the edges, in other words, dissolving into something else, dissolving into formlessness. The form of the world, Bacon famously proclaimed, is actually the form of a puddle of spit, or maybe the pile of oozing animal guts. From Bataille's perspective, the leaking wounds and indeterminate form of Bacon's bodies confront viewers with the dirty secret our knowledge systems are built to disguise. If so, this kind of image challenges the boundaries of what we think of as knowing, as well as the limits of aestheticism, which again is not necessarily an experience that all viewers will welcome. Now, before we move on to another painting, I'm sure at least some of you are wondering about the meaning of the light bulb here, just as Bataille would have predicted. Unfortunately, there's no way to offer a definitive answer. There's no way to control this image. Bacon lived and worked in the same building in South Kensington from 1961 till the time of his death in 1992. His studio was notoriously chaotic. It looked like a huge dumpster inside. And it was illuminated by single light bulbs hung from the ceiling. Similar light bulbs hanging from wires appear in quite a few of his later paintings. Now, kind of as an aside, I've always wondered if he was making a visual pun here by pairing a naked guy with a naked light bulb. But maybe you can come up with a more erudite interpretation. I would also call your attention to the splash of white paint on the figure's back that disrupts the illusion of representation. just as it does in one of the panels of the Lucien Freud triptych. Flashing back a few years to the late 1960s, we see on the screen one of Bacon's many portraits of his second long-term lover, George Dyer. Dyer was a handsome Soho tough guy Bacon has said to have first encountered when Dyer tried to rob his house. And the title of this painting is a portrait of George Dyer staring into a mirror, and it's, again, a 1967 composition. Some critics complain that Bacon became a formally repetitious painter by the mid-1960s, and there's no doubt that he favored certain compositional strategies, although with many variations. Here, for example, the figure is caged by the left edge of the painting instead of being centered on the canvas. The painting is one of several compositions showing a figure and his or her reflection in a mirror. The faces of the figures and the virtual faces don't always match. In fact, they don't usually match. Some writers see Bacon as trying to work against the satisfaction a viewer might derive from identifying with the character in the painting by implying that the character does not identify with himself. Here, Dyer's body is a fugitive being, not because it's fragmented, but because Dyer's self-image seems to be incoherent. Dyer was an uneducated, socially inept fellow. He had problems with drugs and alcohol. In the end, he committed suicide in the Paris hotel room he shared with Bacon when the then 61-year-old Bacon was attending the opening of the biggest show of his career, a retrospective at the Grand Palais in Paris in 1971. Bacon would not have expected his viewers to be familiar with George Dyer or his relationship with the painter. But even so, because Bacon has included, in effect, two figures in this painting, it's tempting to imagine a story about their relationship. Dyer, in fact, seems to have been conflicted about his self-identity and about the masquerade he was sometimes compelled to assume. Bacon's biography, therefore, suggests a reading of this painting as the artist's commentary on his lover's conflicted sense of self. Now, Bacon would have emphatically rejected this biographical interpretation of his work, again because the story might talk louder than the paint. This series is called Three Studies of Figures on Beds from 72, and I'm sorry it's in black and white, but I'll show you the individual panels in color. Bacon continued to favor the triptych format throughout his career, not only for the cinematic effects, but because he could present a group of individual figures at the same time, and yet the separation of the three canvases worked against the imposition of any kind of consistent or overarching narrative. This is the left panel. In this triptych, the figures are again stretched out on beds and are now trapped by circles with arrows. The circles, which concentrate the figures within the frame of the bed, were appropriated from a textbook on radiology. In the textbook, the circles were used to as diagrams to show how various parts of the body are to be positioned so they could be properly photographed with radiology equipment. Early in his career, Bacon also acquired a hand-illustrated textbook on diseases of the mouth, which inspired many of his images of mouths, including possibly this one, where if you look very carefully, you can see suggestions of a red mouth and white teeth that support the reading of this dark object at the bottom of the bed as a head. This is the center panel. It apparently features two figures sexually engaged, although once again it's not clear where the bodies begin and end. The diagrammatic arrow provides a kind of cold, clinical, very cynical framework for this seemingly intimate and yet violent activity. Again, note the splashes of white paint working against the illusionism of the bed and the room, and the single light bulb, which in this case seems to be responsible for the figure's lurid orange glow. This is the right-hand panel. This incredibly foreshortened figure is almost reduced to a foot and a mouth slashed open like a wound. The foot, according to Bataille, is the lowest extremity, not just because it's at the bottom of the leg, but because the foot and the toe are the parts of the body that rest directly on the dirt. Despite the role feet play in standing up, humans secretly believe that they deserve to be rid of their feet, according to Bataille, because feet and toes are perceived to be the antithesis of the spiritual. No matter how hard humans try to elevate their minds, they cannot escape the secret terror of being rooted in the dirty ground. And here you might think of the equation of the shoe with dirt in Middle Eastern cultures, hence the insult of throwing a shoe at someone, which is the same as throwing dirt at someone. We can also see that the figure in this composition is clearly staining the bed from its midsections. And in the right and left panels of the triptych, there appear to be blue stains on the floor. It's really a horrible image. We could neutralize the horror, perhaps, by dismissing the forms as just disturbing communication by a cynical individual. But this kind of dismissal simply transfers the pain of the painting back to Bacon himself without squarely addressing its effect on the viewer. Now, this composition, this triptych is called Three Figures in a Room from 1964. And to go further into the topic of the effect of Bacon's images on his audiences, I'd like to look at the painting on the far left in this triptych. In the 1980s and early 1990s, many artists in the United States discovered the work of the French Lacanian psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva, especially her book called The Powers of Horror. In that text, Kristeva explores the concept of objection, a concept which overlaps in many respects with Bataille's ideas about formlessness. There was a big boom in abject art in the 80s and early 90s by artists like Kiki Smith and Paul McCarthy. But in case you missed all that, the concept of objection as applied to the body has to do with a fundamental need people have to think of their bodies as enclosed spaces, as tight containers with the contents safely sealed inside. Of course, many experiences that we have every day undermine this fantasy. We eat, for example, opening up the container to ingest food. Our bodies also leak. We excrete waste every day, our noses run, blood flows out if we cut ourselves, and women's bodies bleed in monthly cycles. We all know that we will die, and our flesh will disintegrate. Our fantasies about wholeness and containment are constantly being challenged by ordinary everyday experiences and by the inevitability of death. The bodily sites especially associated with violations of the integrity of our physical container, the mouth, the excretory system, the sexual organs, therefore, acquire a particularly charged identity. Anthropologists document these sites as the loci of powerful taboos. Cultural taboos associated with menstruation, for example, are especially strong and numerous. Now, we all know about these sites of objection, but we don't like to think about them. Most cultures repress or veil these reminders of the leaking, porous body and foster a hypocritical aversion to the base materiality of the human body. If Bataille and Kristeva are onto something here, Bacon's paintings seem disturbing to us in part because they remind us of the abject. They set off trains of associations that all viewers feel or understand, even if these feelings are repressed. His paintings remind us of certain experiences we don't like to acknowledge as the reality of the flesh. As Bacon famously said, quote, "I would like my pictures to look as if a human being had passed between them like a snail, leaving a trail of human presence like a snail leaves his slime," end of quote. And there are allusions to human slime in both the imagery and the physical surfaces of many of Bacon's paintings: viscous human excretions, sticky blood, or semen or excrement. Now, not to be irreverent, but maybe that's part of the reason you should be glad that Bacon wanted to have his paintings sealed under glass. Bacon's range of subject matter was relatively limited. He did figure painting, animal paintings, portraiture, and he also painted a few paintings of another physical force, moving water. Although here it's water in a bathroom, water in the private space where we routinely experience the porousness of our bodies. Bacon was originally inspired to create this 1979 painting when he was watching ocean waves and trying to figure out how he could capture the reality of a breaking wave. He first laid out a kind of stage with these semi-architectural forms. Then he said, quote, "I collected an enormous amount of paint and I put it in a bucket and I just threw the paint on the canvas, as you can see. I threw what I hoped would be a wave, and it didn't make a wave. It looked more like a jet of water, so I just turned it into a jet of water." And that's the title of the painting. Now, perhaps it was Bacon's cynicism that makes him comfortable with rolling the dice like this, which is a pretty accurate description of many of the decisions in his career. So now you have quite a broad context for Bacon's approach to this triptych on view in the museum. Most of you know that the sitter in these paintings was Sigmund Freud's grandson, the painter Lucien Freud. Freud was introduced to Bacon in 1945 by Graham Sutherland and was Bacon's friend for many years. You certainly can recognize the compositional strategy here and the 3-camera angle format of this triptych. Now, Bacon was in a paradoxical position when he painted portraits because he was never interested in figurative illustration, which he considered to be simply an intellectual exercise. His goal in portraits was to create a presence beyond likeness, he said, and yet he usually used the likeness captured in photographs as models for his portrait, as he did in this case. So the photograph of Lucien Freud on one side and the face in the left-hand panel of the triptych on the other. Bacon preferred to depend on memory or photographs instead of actual appearances for his portraits, he said, because, quote, "illustrational form tells you through intelligence what the form is about. An abstracted form works first upon sensation and then slowly leaks back into the fact. This may have to do with how facts themselves are ambiguous, how appearances are ambiguous, and therefore this way of recording is nearer to fact in its ambiguity." Bacon typically worked against likeness in his portraits with non-rational marks that may have no obvious representational relationship to the area of the face they are intended to depict. And yet, although irrational in terms of representational logic, they still convey the form of an actual nose or mouth. So this is the whole figure of which you've been seeing details of the face. Even sitting, Bacon's figures seem to be in the grip of muscular forces, convulsions of energy that intensify rather than diminish their living presence. When I look at someone across a table, Bacon said, I don't only see that person, but a whole emanation, which has to do with personality and everything else. And to put that over in painting, as I would like to do in a portrait, means that the image would appear violent in paint. We nearly always live through screens, a screened existence. And sometimes I think when people say my work looks violent, they are saying that I have, from time to time, been able to clear away one or two of the veils or screens, end of quote. This is the right-hand panel of the triptych. Bacon resisted storytelling, but he also believed, quote, why and how a person sits or stands conveys all sorts of other things. The other things he's telling us here about this seated figure involve a person he knew very well, a maverick like himself with against-the-grain ambitions in the context of mid-century modernism. Bacon and Freud shared a preoccupation with drinking and gambling and nightclubs and admiration for each other's work. They were polar opposites in terms of their sexual appetites. Freud was a raging heterosexual who routinely slept with and impregnated his younger female models. Nevertheless, they were close associates from the mid-1940s to the early 1980s, when they finally parted company because Freud disapproved of Bacon's later work. At the very least, Bacon has conveyed here in his seated figure a vigorous and restless being. It's an image poised on a tightrope between abstraction and representation that conveys both fact and the ambiguity of fact, just as Bacon intended. His ambition, he said, was to make an image be as factual as possible and at the same time deeply suggestive or deeply unlocking areas of sensation. So tonight we've considered several writers who've tried to account for Bacon's success in achieving this goal. And fortunately, we have the best evidence for his achievements right here in the Portland Art Museum's gallery. And I hope that you will all revisit the Freud triptych after this talk and think about whether what you've heard lines up with any of your own impressions. So thank you. So we can take a few questions here and so on, but before we do that, I have just a little postscript. As you know, the Freud triptych achieved the highest price for a painting sold at auction at $142 million. Ironically, in 2008, Lucien Freud held the title as painter of the highest priced painting by a living painter sold at auction. This 1955 painting of a favorite model, Sue Tilley, it's titled Benefits Supervisor Sleeping, and it sold for $33.6 million, breaking the record of $23.6 million set a year earlier by one of Jeff Koons's Magenta Hearts. Bacon's work achieved another record last week when this 6-foot 1996 portrait of George Dyer was sold at auction for $70.3 million, a record for a single panel painting by the artist. By this standard, Elaine Wynn's purchase was a real bargain. She got 3 paintings for only $142 million. But the way you can decide what Bacon really achieved and whether he's worth all this money is to visit or revisit the painting next door. So please take advantage of this opportunity tonight. But now we can also take a few questions. And Bacon can look at us while we do that. This is a wonderful photograph by Richard Avedon of Francis Bacon from 1972. The question was elaborating on how their friendship ended. There are a number of stories about, what happened, but in fact, Bacon's paintings of the 80s are not considered by many as successful as work in his earlier career. They really parted company over just, the assessment, having been together and talking about each other's works for years. And Freud really disapproved of that later work. So that's as much as I know about it anyway. Anybody else? Okay, you can all go to the gallery now.